I'm the project associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center for the Cold War International History Project. I coordinate its activities. For those of you who are not familiar with the Wilson Center, for those of you joining us on the web, I'll just say a few words about the center. It is the nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. The center is a nonpartisan institute for advanced study and a neutral forum for open, serious, and informed dialogue. It brings preeminent thinkers to Washington for extended periods of time to interact with policymakers through a large number of programs and projects. The center seeks to separate the important from the inconsequential and to take a historical and broad perspective on the issues. At the Wilson Center, the Cold War International History Project, which is part of the Center's History and Public Policy program, supports the full and prompt release of historical materials from all sides of the Cold War and seeks to accelerate the process of integrating new sources, materials, and perspectives from the former communist bloc with the historiography of the Cold War. It seeks to transcend the barriers of language, geography, and regional specialty to create new links among scholars interested in Cold War history. Among the many activities undertaken by the project are the periodic publication of the bulletin, copies of which are available outside, and I see some of you have picked up a copy, as well as other publications like working papers and e-dossier to disseminate new findings, views, and activities pertaining to Cold War history, as well as the project's virtual archive, the largest collection of declassified communist archival documents available online in translation, and international scholar, as well as international scholarly meetings, conferences, events, and various seminars, much like the one we have today. Let me briefly introduce the two speakers. I can actually have the book back for just 1 second. We are here to discuss The Black Bats, a book published by Chris Pocock, British writer and consultant specializing in aerospace, defense, intelligence, and air logistics. He is currently defense editor of Aviation International News and the European editor of Cargo Facts. He is the author of a number of books on aerial intelligence, including the definitive 50 Years of the U-2, and most recently with Clarence Fu, The Black Cats, CIA spy flights over China from Taiwan, 1951 to 1969, which is the book we'll be discussing today. Joining us on the panel today is Mark Stout, who teaches at Johns Hopkins University's Krieger School of Arts and Sciences and is a former Wilson Center public policy scholar. He is a veteran of several U.S. intelligence organizations and is currently writing a book on the creation of the modern U.S. intelligence community. He is the author of numerous articles and books dealing with intelligence, terrorism, and foreign policy. And as of next week, he will be the International Spy Museum's resident historian. So, Chris, the floor is yours for about 20-25 minutes or so, and we'll give it to Mark, and then we'll open up to Q&A from the audience.
Okay, well, thanks, Mircea, and thanks to the project for inviting me back so soon after I was last here. For those of you that weren't here last time, I was here in late April when we held a seminar here to mark the 50th anniversary of the shooting down of the U-2, and that, like this seminar, I'm told, will be available subsequently on the project's website. So let's get going. I put up there the basics of this squadron, and I need to do that even for a non-aviation audience because very little has ever been published about this operation. But there you see the bare bones of it. I'm going to skip over some of the slides in this presentation because they are aimed at a more aviation audience, but if you just cast your eye down there, you'll see the basics, and the airplane there in that picture is the P-2V. That was the Neptune, which was the standard U.S. maritime patrol plane, and that was the plane that took over the majority of the operations from the B-17s, which had previously done the job in this squadron. And this is what they did. starting in 1953 and going all the way through until the late 60s. Starting really as a covert operation for dropping agents and propaganda leaflets, but graduating, if you like, into a SIGINT role in the mid to late 50s, and the purpose being to determine Chinese air defense capability. And into the 60s, when China began developing nuclear weapons, the squadron did have a role in nuclear sampling. To set this in context and also to clear up some confusion, this squadron was the Black Bats, and it's sort of an analogue to another squadron which is better known, not least because I've written about it, called the Black Cats. And that was a high-level, high-altitude daytime photo operation, similarly a joint venture between the nationalists and the US that operated in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And it was one, as you see, of a number of joint intelligence-driven projects between the US and the Republic of China, the ROC, the others being listed there. Civil Air Transport being the airline that was created by General Chennault and survived the Second World War to become Taiwan's national airline of the 50s and into the 60s, while actually being owned as a proprietary by the CIA, the US CIA, who bought it in 1950. And Western Enterprises was the first cover name, if you like, for the US covert presence on Taiwan from 1950. How did I write this book and come to it? Through my own previous work, the U-2, as I previously mentioned, with that Taiwan connection that got me tuned into this area of work. Other published work, I cite 22 English language books in the book, and in the back they're all listed. I'd like to mention in particular the works of Conboy and Morrison, who've written about CIA covert operations in enormous detail, in fact probably in too great a detail to assimilate, but outstanding work in a difficult area. Unless you're really into this subject, you probably want to read instead John Prados's book, and John's here, because that'll give you a better overview of CIA covert operations. And another key book by Jay Taylor, who's recently published a biography of Chiang Kai-shek, but whose previous work, a biography of Chiang Ching-kuo, was a valuable background material to me. This because Chiang Ching-kuo had a key role in this project. I was able to do interviews here in the US with a number of participants in this project. I was able to use a few documents from the CREST. For those of you that are not familiar, the CREST is the CIA record search tool, which is a repository, an electronic repository at the National Archives of thousands, maybe millions by now, of declassified documents. However, very few from this operation, and that's a shame. My co-author who started this particular ball rolling in Taiwan, who wrote a book in Chinese about this operation, and therefore he conducted the interviews with the Taiwanese about this, which I have used. But most importantly, especially given the lack of US declassification, we've had access to official documents in Taiwan and to official books, a couple of official books, mainly in Chinese language, of course. And last but not least, we've also used an officially sanctioned history of the air defense troops of the People's Liberation Army. The politics of this time, Chiang Kai-shek, of course, and the back to the mainland. I haven't got time to deal with this fully. Those of you who are scholars in this area know perfectly what I'm talking about here. One of the things that's interesting coming out of it, I think, was the U.S. equivocation. You could almost call it confusion about what its policy was towards the nationalists and the retaking of the mainland. Maybe we can return to that in discussion later. Certainly the distinction to be made between the official help to the nationalists on Taiwan through the MAAG, the Military Aid and Assistance Group, which began in 1951, and the covert help, which came through CIA and the Western Company. Just a reminder that the US-Taiwan relationship was formalized in 1954 and was therefore in place during the two big political crises in 1958 and the second lesser known but still important Taiwan Straits crisis of 1962. And part of that equivocation and confusion that I refer to is about the State Department and the official U.S. policy versus the covert action policy of the agency and the priorities and the relative weight to give to the two kinds of support to Taiwan. The origins of the squadron was CAT, Civil Air Transport, which had done overflights of the China mainland during the Korean War from Taiwan. But the last bullet point there is of some significance because Operation Tropic was a provision by Civil Air Transport of airplanes that flew into Manchuria on covert airdropping and air agent recovery during the Korean War. And one of those planes was shot down in November 1952, resulting in the death of 3 of the 5 all-American crew on it and the capture of the other 2. And that really led President Truman to decree that no more such operations should be mounted over mainland China. Let's use the nationalist Chinese. So that's kind of, I mentioned that in chapter 1, and it's kind of the beginning, the reason that this squadron that I'm writing about came to do such a lot. And it was originally called the Special Missions Group. That's a B-17, a Second World War bomber that was their first equipment, modified for the dropping of agents and propaganda leaflets. And they used B-26s as well. That's another Second World War bomber, faster. They did daylight, nighttime in the B-17, but these guys had a lot of courage, these Taiwanese crew. They flew these planes during the day on leaflet drops, and I have in mind in particular a mission over Shanghai in 1954 on Sino-Soviet Friendship Day, when they literally flew down Main Street, Shanghai, at 100 feet, dropping leaflets, reminding the population of the price that was to be paid for China's friendship with the Soviet Union. And here are just some examples of some of the leaflets that they dropped. These are actual examples of the leaflets. I don't think I've got time. I have translations of those, but I don't think I've got time to go into them. Actually, that one's pretty self-evident if you look at it. And I think you can probably guess what that one's all about. Some idea of the extent of these missions. The one on the left is one of their early flights all the way to that area, which was an area where the
Take the mic with you when you
oh, okay. To that area where the nationalists still had hopefully some supporting forces that might still foment rebellion. But the flights didn't come without a penalty, and as you can see here, they began to lose airplanes and crews to China's improving air defenses. And the flights were being conducted under full moon conditions because that was easier to navigate, of course, but the Chinese air defenses improved to the point where those nationalist crews had to be trained to penetrate only in the dark moon phase. All the training, of course, provided by US instructor pilots seconded to the agency. The leaflets had, I mean, we can discuss the leaflets later perhaps, but they did certainly, I mean, there's one documented way that they did help, and they did have an effect, because here you see a leaflet that was dropped over the Chinese mainland's air bases, and it gave the pilots of the PLA Air Force an opportunity to defect to Taiwan, and it gave them a heading, a course to fly, and a distance to go, since, of course, their own maps were carefully had Taiwan snipped out of them for security purposes. And if you go to Taiwan today, to the Museum of the Republic of China Air Force, you'll find on display 5 of those MiGs, because that's how many got there who did defect, 5 of them. Anyway, the B-17s were getting old in the tooth by the mid-50s. CIA embarked upon a project to replace them with the P-2V, the Navy patrol plane, and there's some basics. They wanted to fly those in Europe as well. That's what they were also bought for, and that lasted about 2 years. And then the 2 airplanes that are deployed to Europe were returned to the States, and then they subsequently were fed into the Chinese operation. There's a picture of the aircraft on the first 2 of those, an overhead from Hsinchu Air Base, the air base that was used to house this squadron on the west coast of Taiwan, right opposite the mainland, about an hour and a half's drive from Taipei. And the project names, the unclassified and the cryptonym, joint operation. NACC was the next cover name for the agency's operations in Taiwan after the Western Company. NACC, the Naval Auxiliary Communications Center, but nothing to do with the Navy, actually. And this project run on the US side by an Air Force colonel detailed to the agency with a manager at the air base, and on the ROC side you see the chain of command, and that's one of the commanders of that's one of the commanders of the squadron with his US counterpart. And it very much was a joint operation, and you can see the close relations that developed in this operation, which struck me, and which was why the person that prompted me to do it over here, who said that this was the most intense and interesting time of his whole career in the agency. And on the top left you see Ray Klein, who was the station chief in Taiwan from 58 to 62. Anyway, whenever he came back here to become DDI, and he's doing the bottoms-up cheer kampai with the general, the intel general, General E, from the Chinese Air Force. The right picture at the top shows the air section commander, the Air Force colonel, pinning Chinese wings on one of the participants. Bottom right, you see, there you see Chiang Ching-kuo at a party. He was there often. He's enjoying some social chat there with the colonel, the Air Force colonel, and his wife. And on the left, you have on the right the wife of the Chinese general that ran the show, and on the left, the wife of one of the agency people from the States, and her first name was Polly. We don't have enough declassified documents to tell you with certain assurance that that's how the cryptonym for the project came about, but it's if not, it's a big coincidence. I'll skip through some of this. These are typical missions flown when they got the P2Vs. You can see the kind of territory that they were covering. And the thing to mention here is that the Chinese took these incursions very seriously indeed. It was a matter of high priority for Mao and Zhou to try and prevent these from continuing. And the ingenuity of the Chinese technical ingenuity as they adapted their Soviet-supplied equipment is a key theme running through the book. And remember that the Sino-Soviet split came in 1960, so the Chinese were effectively on their own from then, but they still managed to combat the flights in very ingenious ways that I don't have time to get into here. There's a Chinese crew, a nationalist crew, who came back despite a AAA shot through the wing there. And I should mention that I think from this particular crew, only 2 of these guys survived the squadron. All the others were subsequently shot down and killed either shot down or killed in training accidents. And there's a kind of a roll call of the accidents and losses of the 5. The agency had 5 of those P2V Neptunes converted for its own specialist use, and all 5 of them were lost. They subsequently converted another 2 as replacements. And the cat and mouse game between the penetrating aircraft and the Chinese air defenses caused the US side to put some significantly new and technologically advanced equipment on the airplane, in particular that first item there, which was the first of its kind to be flown in a operational, I'm choosing my words carefully, reconnaissance aircraft, because the US Navy had been the kind of pioneers in this kind of technology, air defense, defending the aeroplane against radar surveillance, so air-to-air radar surveillance. But anyway, they even put Sidewinder missiles, by the way, on these planes towards the end of their time. The P2Vs all shot down. The agency decided to replace them with a P3s, which was in turn the Navy's own next maritime patrol aeroplane. So there's a little bit about that. Those airplanes did get deployed to Taiwan, but never did fly over the mainland, because in January of '67, the new DCI, Dick Helms, arrived and reviewed a number of programs, including this one, and canned it. They had not flown, by the way, over the mainland for a couple of years before that. Well, I mean, the leaflets and back to the mainland, obviously you all know it was a hopeless strategy. This is the kind of thing that the nationalists hoped to persuade the local population was going on. And of course, in reality, it wasn't. The communists had a lockstep control over their population. This squadron got involved in Vietnam. It kind of was the CIA's subcontract guys. With their expertise, they became employed to run the covert insertions into North Vietnam flying from an airbase in the south using C-123 assault transports provided by the US. And again, a lot of flights, as you can see at the bottom there. Oh, the picture's missing. I think I'm going to have to skip over this in the interest of time, but basically they did, even after the squadron was stopped flying over mainland China, there was one last hurrah from them in 1969, a tremendous mission in terms of operational art and operational chutzpah, if you like, flying out of Taiwan in a C-130 to drop sensors in the vicinity of the Chinese nuclear test site and the Chinese missile range. The US wanted, of course, to learn about China's nuclear developments in the worst way and went to extraordinary lengths to gain technical intelligence on them, and this was just one of a number of extraordinary projects to do so. We'll skip through that. And I'll finish just with a few closing thoughts. I think I've already said Chiang Ching-kuo, very important in this project, and important in many ways before he took over from his father, and indeed before he became the premier even. He essentially ran the intel operations on Taiwan from about the mid-50s. Mao and Chou, I've already talked about that. The purpose and value of covert operations. Confusion again, I think. You see it here, you see it in these operations, you see it over North Vietnam, and you see it in so many of the other Cold War covert operations. The distinction that gets blurred between covert operations that are being performed to try and foment rebellion, pretty much a hopeless task in most situations, and the covert operations which are the airdropping of agents to gather intelligence. And I see a confusion there, and other authors have done so. This is not a unique insight that I'm providing. This is a typical example of a black project that survived through inertia. I think their mission was done by 1964. It was getting too dangerous to fly these planes, and they did only a couple of missions in 1965 and 1966. But the thing dragged on, and this enormous amount of money was spent on that P3 operation to no avail. It was never used, and you have to wonder about that. I make some provisional conclusions in the book. They're provisional because the agency hasn't declassified its own internal history or documents about that. And of course, much that people like myself are aircraft aviation historians, and we get bound up in technical intelligence and the wonders of it. We must never forget that programs like this don't provide intel on strategic intent. And by goodness, as the Cultural Revolution began and China descended into a certain amount of chaos and had the nuclear weapon, and what's going on there and what would be the strategic intent, this program could not contribute much to that effort. And finally, this program actually, the ending of it caused a bit of grief at the time, and the CIA station chief was blackballed for a year by Chiang Ching-kuo, which was pretty serious when you consider the relationship. And it was kind of the beginning of the end. The Taiwanese saw the thin end of a wedge that would grow to become the Nixon-Kissinger opening to China, and indeed the history of the 70s, where Taiwan was very nearly sold down the river by the US administration and rescued only by the Taiwan Relations Act of 1978. So I think I will stop there. Chiang Kai-shek with having just awarded medals to some of these air crew.
Thank you, Chris. Very much appreciated. Comments from Mark, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So,
well, thank you very much, and thank you to Chris for a fascinating talk. I was concerned I was going to have to talk with a Generalissimo looming over my shoulder, but fortunately I'm not. Is this on, by the way? I can't quite tell from where.
I think it is.
All right, great. I should say just to start off with that my background in intelligence is more in Europe and the intelligence confrontation with the Soviets. I am decidedly not a sinologist. Nevertheless, let me just start off by saying that I'm really delighted to see this excellent work that Chris and his colleague have produced, because it seems to me that the written intelligence historiography of the Cold War is a little out of whack, in the sense that it really has never, to my mind, paid as much attention to China and for that matter East Asian matters, laying aside the Vietnam War, as was in fact paid by the protagonists at the time. So I'm delighted to see something which at least starts to address that. Maybe not gap, but thin area, if you will, in histories. I'd like to make a few comments that focus less on East Asia per se, and really more on what this book represents in terms of research approaches and also opportunities in the context of where we stand in the field of intelligence history now. And I also want to comment a bit on some of the themes that we find in this book and how it resonates with what we know of Cold War intelligence history elsewhere. To start off, some of you may have seen there was a very interesting item that appeared in the Secrecy News blog a few days ago, reporting on a talk that historian Steve Budiansky gave at the National Cryptologic Museum recently. It was I wasn't there, which is probably fortunate because I think it would have opened a vein if I had been. But the long and the short of his talk was basically to suggest that intelligence history is in the process of dying. In fact, he suggested that it may be the unfortunate truth that David Kahn, who in many ways is the granddaddy of all of this, will have invented the field, seen it flourish, and seen it die all within his lifetime. I think this claim is overstated, but nonetheless, I think there's a substantial kernel of truth to it, and I think it's particularly true with regard to signals intelligence history. And much of this book, The Black Bats, though Chris didn't particularly dwell on it in his talk, but deals with our efforts in cooperation with Taiwan, or the Taiwanese efforts in cooperation with us is probably a better way to put it, to collect electronic intelligence against the People's Republic of China. As one example of the grim situation that Budiansky suggests that we're in, he'd been discussing this topic, by the way, with Professor David Alvarez, one of the great names in the field right now. Alvarez had recently been on a committee that was supposed to award a prominent prize for the best new article in SIGINT history, and they received no papers to consider, which I find a little disturbing. It is true, and I think you touched on it tangentially here in your talk, and perhaps in order to spread hate and discontent, you can talk about it a little more in Q&A, it's true that the agencies are doing relatively little to help historians in terms of providing original records. The CIA is a partial exception. I say only partial, and I say this lovingly as a former CIA employee. I think it's interesting to note that the CIA gave access to Evan Thomas, when he was writing The Very Best Men, to quite a number of clandestine service histories that it seems to me would have been relevant to your work. My impression is that none of those have shown up in CREST. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on whether, in fact, you actually saw any of those. I know one particular one you were after was not forthcoming from the agency. However, with all that as sort of the grim background, I think there's a partial solution to this problem, this impasse that we find ourselves in intelligence history. And Chris really has employed it here in this book, though he admits himself this book is more in the genre of aviation history than intelligence history per se. I want to suggest that this book shows what can be done by taking what you might call the indirect approach, with apologies to Little Heart. It's long seemed to me that given that United States intelligence operated during the Cold War alongside many nations and against many other nations, that really interesting insights could be gained by really methodical, careful research through the records of those countries. And that's precisely what Chris has done here. the various countries that we've targeted, the various countries that we've worked alongside, their declassification systems differ from us, their political circumstances differ from us. I think by marrying American records with foreign records, sometimes we can go a lot farther. Now, of course, language is often a problem, and was to some extent in this project, and I imagine that's probably particularly true for Americans seeking to work in East Asian history. It is a sad fact that Chinese is a low-density language compared with all the European languages that you know, I and many of us speak. That can be addressed by taking on foreign partners, again, as been done here. And in the case of Taiwan, as Chris has talked about, he was fortunate to find a situation where the circumstances are such that the Taiwanese Air Force is rightly proud of what they accomplished with the Black Bats, and there was an opportunity here. So I applaud Chris and Clarence for taking on this topic. As I've indicated, I think the East Asian Cold War is much neglected. It's sort of a sideshow in the popular perception. We tend to forget it now, but during the Cold War, the intelligence effort against the People's Republic of China was a substantial one. Those of you, for instance, who are familiar with NSA, who've read James Bamford's book, will recall that in the good old days, on the SIGINT production side in NSA, there were three big groups. There was A Group, Soviet bloc, there was G Group, rest of world, and then there was B Group, which was primarily China with the other communist Asian countries thrown in. Evan Thomas, again, whom I mentioned earlier, in The Very Best Men, gives another metric of how important East Asia, and in particular China, was to the agency, or more particularly in this specific case, to the office of Frank Wisner's Office of Policy Coordination, when he discussed how Western Enterprises Incorporated, whom we heard a little bit about here earlier, was at one point such a big agency effort in Taiwan that the agency was pumping so much money into WEI that they were actually afraid that they were going to be causing serious inflation in the Taiwanese currency. This suggests to me that this is, you know, something that we today, with the exception of the gentleman sitting to my right, are not paying enough attention to. I would also say that SIGINT, signals intelligence, is a much neglected topic in intelligence history. Certainly not that, I don't want to say that nobody writes on it, but I would say that relatively few people do by comparison with the people who work on, you know, the flashy sorts of clandestine human intelligence operations and that sort of thing. So I applaud Chris for writing a book that focuses on electronic intelligence as a major theme. Electronic intelligence is sort of the neglected younger brother of communications intelligence. If communications intelligence is what gives us sexy things like the Zimmerman telegram, electronic intelligence gives us decidedly unsexy things like pulse repetition frequencies on radars. Monumentally uninteresting in the wrong hands to read about, but also monumentally important, particularly when you're looking at things like developing war plans. And we have to remember that one of the major reasons that a lot of these efforts against China, and for that matter analogous efforts against the Soviet Union, were launched is so that Strategic Air Command would be able to fly its way around the air defenses and get in and drop nuclear weapons on China. In fact, I would say that if I had one criticism of this book, it would be that I'd have liked to have seen a little bit more on how the emerging understanding that came out as a result of these operations of what the people in the business call the Chinese electronic order of battle, i.e. what are their radars, where are they, and what are their technical capabilities, how that interacted, if it did in fact in any substantive way, with our nuclear war plans. An official historian of the U.S. Air Force has written a book very much along these lines with regard to the Soviet Union, and I wonder if we might not be in a position to be able to do some similar sorts of work with regard to China. Something I did like, skipping from my one criticism, something I really did like about this book is that it makes clear that, you know, some of the issues of working with liaison partners, in this case working with the Republic of China, working with Taiwan, I think too often outsiders, when they're aware of liaison relationships at all, portray them in either one of two sort of caricatured kinds of ways. Either that the United States, typically the CIA, is in full control, and this other little country is merely our pawn and, you know, salutes smartly and does exactly what we want. Or sometimes the sort of the alternative view, you know, sort of the 180 degrees out from that is sometimes the liaison partner is seen as exploiting the incompetent or naive Americans who really, you know, all they bring to the table is money and a can-do spirit. You see this a lot of times in the literature discussing the British relations with American intelligence during World War II and the early Cold War. You also have seen it much more recently showing up in the discussions of how certain foreign intelligence service sold us letters from Italy about Iraqi uranium purchases. But I think this book really is excellent in terms of showing what's more often the reality, the give and take between partners who perceive common, that is to say, overlapping interests, but not a complete unity of interest at all. And you referred in towards the end of your remarks to the angst that was caused in Taiwan when the United States withdrew its support from this operation and wanted to wind this down. Elsewhere in the book, there's a discussion about how the Taiwanese were flying penetration missions into the People's Republic of China for their own purposes that we didn't know about, or at least that we weren't supposed to know about. It wasn't quite entirely clear to me. I'm sorry?
Nor me.
Okay, fair enough. This may not have been a partnership of equals. The United States is a whole lot bigger than Taiwan, but to say that Taiwan was without agency, if you will, to use a little jargon here, would be utterly untrue. And I would argue that that ought to be our positive expectation whenever we look at U.S. intelligence cooperation with another country. Couple other quick points. I believe it's John Ferris, a prominent historian in the field from Canada, who suggests that intelligence history is primarily important when it's either also diplomatic history or also military history, a view that I generally tend to share. I think one of the really fascinating parts of this book was the discussion of how the PLA Air Force adapted to counter these Taiwanese overflights, including turning bombers into interceptor aircraft, which is the first time I'd ever heard of anybody doing that. Let me just say, in the context of military history, the subject of military adaptation is a very hot topic these days. And military adaptation is how do militaries react to the inevitable disconnect between plans, what you think you're going to do, and the reality of war? How do you fix those problems? And they can be little problems, it can be tactical adaptation, or it can be big problems, it can be strategic adaptation. I think this is a topic that intelligence historians ought to pay more attention to, of intelligence adaptation. And, consistent with this notion that intelligence history and military history are often the same thing, it just depends on, how you're tilting your head when you look at them. Intelligence adaptation was precisely what the PLA Air Force was doing here. It was a certain form of counterintelligence. They wanted to counter intelligence collection missions, also insertion missions. So all of that's by way of saying, while I am more than a little sympathetic to the Budiansky and Alvarez, laments about the state of the field, I think there are other ways of looking at intelligence history that can keep it from looking quite as moribund as it appears to be. The last thing I want to touch on, again, deals with this question of the overlap of intelligence history and military history. There's another topic that Chris alludes to a couple times in the book that at a number of points the CIA, in the early 60s, the CIA became concerned about whether, in fact, the overflights of China were actually being counterproductive, in the sense that were they stimulating the People's Republic of China to increase their air defense capabilities, which would then actually impede the execution of the war plan that these missions were intended to enable? Were we, in some sense, shooting ourselves in the foot here, or were we allowing the Taiwanese to shoot us in the foot, is maybe a better way of putting it. It's not clear, again, that Chris was able to come to a firm conclusion on this, and it's a tough analytic question in any event. But that said, I think it's a really important one, and in a broader context than just the People's Republic of China. Certainly savvy senior military commanders in combat are well aware of the fact that intelligence operations can influence the enemy, influence his plans, influence his deployments on the ground, that sort of thing. It's less clear to me that the same is the case at the national level, in part because analysts are seldom more than marginally informed about the collection activities that get them the information that they assess. And I can tell you certainly that having worked briefly on the Soviet Union and at greater length on Russia on the military side, I often found in my work that the Russians had some very odd notions about threat perceptions from time to time. And almost without exception, when I took the time to pry into the backstory behind this, I was able to find that the United States was doing something that caused that threat perception. Now, the Russians were routinely misunderstanding them or blowing them out of proportion, but often, in fact, usually, there was a kernel of truth there. And I suspect that the same dynamic was probably at work here in China. It would require access to Chinese records of some sort, but I rather think it would be interesting and rewarding to look at Chinese threat perceptions to see how and if they responded to and were influenced by this, extensive overflight record. At any rate, I'm fairly sure I'm not the person you came to hear, so I'll just stop here, and maybe we can go to Q&A.
So, thank you, Mark. I'm going to open it up to questions, so could you please wait for the microphone and identify yourself? This is actually important, since if you're not waiting for the mic, we wouldn't be able to get you on tape. So let's start right here.
Test.
Will Amatruda, I have read the autobiography of General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who's best known as the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II. But in his autobiography, he mentions being the Air Force commander in charge of setting up the first Air Force installation in Taiwan, I think in the 50s, and becoming close personal friends with Tiger Wang, who was the commander of the Chinese Air Force. And I wonder if you found in your research any connection that he had with this operation, because in his autobiography, he really doesn't say what he's there to do, other than what I just said.
Yeah, well, no, I have nothing on that, and I presume that he was there to help develop the formal military cooperation through the MAG, the Military Aid and Assistance Group, which was a very important entity on Taiwan right from 1954, when the Mutual Defense Treaty was signed, through to 1970, whenever it was, when it disbanded. But the thing to stress is that this was not an Air Force operation. This was a CIA operation with the nationalists, and it was completely separately, a completely separate chain of command, which ran through the NACC headquarters in Washington, back in Taipei, and back to Washington. Air Force input through personnel, as I described, but a completely different matter from the MAG.
John?
Hi, John Prados, National Security Archive. Let me pick up on Mark Stout's point about executing the war plan and the problems of intelligence flights. As you mentioned, Chris, there were a whole series of crises over the Taiwan Straits through the late 1950s and early 1960s. What does your research show about the intelligence programs? That is to say, were the intelligence programs stimulated by these crises? Were they carried out responding to the crises? Were they precipitating of crises?
I don't think you could say they were precipitating them. They certainly helped to stimulate the U-2 program, the high-level daylight photo, because that became a major source of imagery intelligence on Taiwan from 62 through to 74, and indeed helped to the U.S. policymakers to understand the nature and extent of the Chinese build-up on the mainland in both times. I don't have any, and the SIGINT station, the U.S. SIGINT station, the NSA operation at Shilinku, will clearly have also played a part in that. I haven't looked at that in my book. A difficult area, I leave that to others. I think that's probably all I can usefully say on that.
And you had a question right now.
David Brown from SICE. I would like to ask you to say a little bit more about how this program wound down. At one point you said, I think, that in 1964 it got too dangerous and the number of flights declined. And then you mentioned that Helms came to to become DCI, and he terminated it. This seems to imply that there was no foreign policy input into the decisions to end this program. And I wonder what your research shows about how the people in the State Department in particular who were interested in improving relations with China might have viewed this program, and how whether they played any role in Helms's decision to turn it down. How does the ending of this program relate to the fact that the U-2 flights continued a little bit longer?
Yeah, you probably find the answers to that in the records of the special group subcommittee of the National Security Council, but I'm not aware that any of those records have been declassified. There was a constant tension, I believe, or I don't know whether tension's the word, but I mean the State Department and its objectives for Taiwan and for relations with China did not always gel with the promotion of covert action by CIA and Taiwan, that's for sure. I could tell you more about the U-2. You can clearly see that because that operation continued after this one and into the 70s, it became discussed at the highest levels and indeed when I think Dr. Kissinger made his very first secret visit to Beijing, one of the very first things that Joe and I mentioned was the U-2 flights and stop them please. Again, I think that's probably as much as I can say.
My name is Stephen Shore. Would you know whether the Air Force of the ROK was engaged in similar overflight efforts, and if so, whether they were done in cooperation with the Air Force of ROC?
The Republic of Korea? Yes. Oh, Korea plays a part in this story insofar as this squadron deployed to Korea, to U.S. air bases on Korea, to launch or recover missions when they were flying over Manchuria and the northern part of China. I'm not aware of any other link with this operation other than the historic link that I mentioned as to how this came about in 1953. And I've not studied, or I've not looked for any particular Korean analog to this operation. I'm not aware of any, and I think I might be if there had been such an operation. Certainly it cannot have been anything like on the scale of this, and I am not aware of any such operation. Oh, while we're heading there, a couple of points in response to John. The issue of the Chinese electronic order of battle and its as discovered by this squadron and how it fed into the PSYOP is an interesting one, and I certainly considered it. But I think that was actually the NISs and the NIEs are available, and you can see how good they were on, especially the NISs, which are the lower level detail. You can see how good they were on Chinese air defenses by 1966. Discouragingly, though, I did talk to one of the staffers from the agency's office of ELINT who used to go and brief Strategic Air Command at Offutt, and said that they expressed very little interest in what this squadron was up to. But I couldn't pursue that because everything's pretty much classified. And I think you'd find it, actually, Mark, you'd have a tough time analysing that, even if you had access to the classified. The extent to which any particular operation would feed into the PSYOP. But I mean, John may have a view on that since he's written a lot on that. But anyway, that's as for the Evan Thomas and his access to the a series of clandestine service histories which remain classified to this day. An agency historian told me, oh, that'll never happen again, i.e. such access. The same historian told me that, by the way, there is a clandestine service history written on this program, which we FOIA'd and which the agency denied in full. And I actually lobbied at the highest level in the CIA to have that history reviewed, and I mean at the highest level, and nothing was done. I don't know whether something will be done now. It's very noticeable that when authors and researchers from outside do manage to come up with significant historical information on classified agency programs, that the situation suddenly changes inside the agency. And I'm thinking of the Azorian Jennifer project, where, lo and behold, the agency has just released a redacted version of that history shortly after a British researcher produced a rather interesting documentary film on it. But anyway, that's the situation as regards US declassification.
I have, with regard.
Just please identify yourself.
I'm sorry.
Your name, please.
Your name.
Thank you.
I use material a lot, and because my colleague, my good friend David is, I'm following up with David's question on the second question. In my research on this topic, I have read your co-author's book on the black cats and all the special missions of the ROC Air Force. In that, Clarence Fu claimed that when the first U-2 was shut down, Colonel or Commander Yi was furious, and he was having a party with the Americans, and he was so furious he went right to the CIA contact, and he challenged him. He said, "You guys, you lied to me. You said that the Chinese, the PRC, the Chicon would not have the ability to shoot down the U-2, and see what happened. The two of them just died," he said. And I did not know the Americans' reaction to that, because in his book he didn't mention that.
Well,
now, the second question is that altogether in China they displayed 5 U-2s being shut down. I saw the picture of 4, and I visited their museum. Now, when was the last U-2 shut down in China? And whether or not the foreign policy decision play any part, this is to follow up with David Brown's question, in the termination of the program. Thank you.
okay, well, just to again stress that this book is about the black bats and not about the black cats, which was the high-altitude U-2 squadron. I've written previously about that as part of a very large book that I wrote to mark the 50th anniversary of the U-2. So there are a number of chapters in that book which discuss the Taiwan U-2 operation. I don't have a comment specifically on General Yi's reported reaction. You must be talking about September 62, when the first U-2 was shot down over China. For those of you that are not aware, 5 U-2s were shot down over China. I don't think he mentions that in his autobiography, that incident, and I would be surprised if the US had withheld the basic information about the vulnerability or not of the U-2. And of course anyone could tell. Well, how could you possibly do so? And indeed, any intel officer would understand that it was an issue because this was 2 years after Powers had been shot down. They put the Chinese government put on display the first 4 U-2s to be shot down. After the fourth was lost in January of '65, the fifth was lost in 1967. The overflights of the mainland by the U-2 ceased in 1968, but the squadron continued to fly peripheral missions down the China coast all the way through to 1974.
John Bissett here. Chris and I have cooperated on certain projects. First, a question about the ELINT aspect we were talking about. I assume, and maybe you can verify this because you mentioned the PACOM ELINT Center on your view graph. The ELINT take from these black bat flights was going to the PACOM ELINT Center?
It went to the PACOM ELINT Center exclusively until 1962, when a analysis center was built at Hsinchu, at the air base, so that detailed analysis of could also be done in Taiwan with Taiwanese ECM officers involved. Okay.
In the American system, we of course had there was an ELINT center at SAC. There was one in EUCOM, a European ELINT center, and one in the Pacific. And theoretically, they were supposed to be sharing their data all the time. And it may have improved over time. And I wasn't in the field in the 1960s to cooperate or to say anything authoritative about that. By the 70s, I could see that at least in the European theater, that was working quite well. But when you mentioned that SAC treated this very lightly, I couldn't help but think of a SAC where it's not invented here. It can't be as good as what our people are getting, sort of syndrome, which is true in a lot of areas in the military and other parts of the world. So that's all I can think of there, that SAC treated whatever they were getting via this system lightly because of that.
There's a lovely story which I mention in the book about the PACOM ELINT Center that was felt they were in need of a Chinese linguist to listen to the COMINT, the communications intelligence tape, to kind of, this is before the analysis center was set up, so that they could understand a little more about the air defense reaction and collate it with the actual electronic intelligence, all the pulse repetition frequencies and all that. So they actually found a Chinese American and who'd been somewhere, some technical sergeant, and they sent him all the way over to Japan and got him set up and brought his family over, and he got the clearances he needed, and he sat down in the center, and they played him one of these tapes, and they said, "So what's going on here?" And he turned around and said, "I don't know, they talk some kind of technical shit." And so he spent the 3 years of his tour, I don't know, cleaning out the latrines or something. I don't know. He was, and I mean, it's a lovely story, but I mean, there is an issue here about the Chinese language and how you technically translate and indeed how you communicate with your partners on technical matters in a language that is built on pictograms, you know, and not based on Roman scripts. And I mean, now you're getting into linguistics here, which is way beyond my pay grade, but I'm sure it's a factor.
Expertise evolves over time, and this is probably especially true beginning in the 50s in this thing and up to the 60s. By the 80s, I think it was working quite well, 70s and 80s, this sort of interchange, this sort of analysis.
My name is Norman Fu. I'm a writer of the China Times of Taiwan. I'd like to ask you about some of the Taiwan pilots who flew these U-2 planes were captured by China. They were shot down, but not killed. They survived, and then they were sent to prison camps and kept there for years. I believe in the late 70s or early 80s, some of them were released. And they indicated that they wanted to go back to Taiwan, so they were sent to Hong Kong. Ironically, Taiwan didn't want to take them back, worrying that they might have been so brainwashed and converted as spies. So they refused to take them back. They were stranded in Hong Kong. But eventually they ended up in the States, apparently with the help of the CIA. So my question to you is, what kind of a contractual relationship these pilots had with the CIA? Did they get back pay? Like that Mr. Powers way back who was shot down in Soviet Russia. But I know for a fact at least 2 of them were resettled in the States.
I can see that we're not going to escape the U-2 this afternoon, and that is also a rod for my own back that I've made probably by becoming identified as the U-2 unofficial historian. Read my book, basically, on the U-2. I told that story. I think I was the first one to tell it fully. And it, as regards the... Oh, and those 2 are still alive. One of them lives in the US and one of them lives in Taiwan, in Taipei. But it does bring something, if we've got time here, that I kind of reminds me to mention about all this. And when you say that Jiang Xingkuo, for it was he who refused to let them back into Taiwan, that was indeed true. But they were by no means unique because others who had fought the secret war for Taiwan on the mainland, and that there were other examples of people that weren't allowed back into Taiwan. It didn't happen in this outfit because, unfortunately, most of the airmen were killed. There was a B-26 that was shot down where the pilots, 2 of the 5 crew survived, and this was in 1958. They were held for 9 months, then released, and they were allowed back to Taiwan. So, but I think Clarence, my co-author, told me about other instances where former people who had fought the nationalist cause on the mainland did escape to Hong Kong and were not allowed to go to Taiwan. Divided loyalties. This is a very interesting subject. Here's an example from the book. There are, of course, all the families, the divided families, those who escaped the mainland in 1949, a whole bunch of people who ended up in this squadron, Air Force trainees who separated from their families. Were their loyalties divided? There was an undercurrent of counterintelligence work to be done in setting up this squadron, especially from the US side, if not the Taiwanese side itself. One particular captain of P2Vs in the squadron, his father had been a general in the Kuomintang and had surrendered towards the end of the Civil War to the communist forces and had therefore been remained on the mainland. And through whatever means, the mainland found out that the son was flying these planes, and they got the father to record a message to his son, appealing to him to turn himself, basically to come over. This kind of thing happened a lot and was broadcast on HF across the Straits. But in this particular case, the cunning plan of the communists was to broadcast this appeal from the father on the air defense net, because they knew that an operator on the penetrating P2V would be listening to the air defense net. And that duly happened, and that message was put on intercom, so the whole crew of the plane shared it, including the pilot, whose father was appealing to him, and he was overcome, of course, but his co-pilot took over the mission. But I have that described in the book, and that kind of gives you a flavour for the divided loyalties and the counterintelligence implications of an operation like this.
Well, on that note, I think there's a consensus here that the book is going to make for a very interesting read, and there's information about how to get copies of it.
Sorry, I've got them here.
It's
time for my. It's time for my.
Even better. In that case, you can pick one up from Chris. Thank you all for coming. We very much appreciate your participation, and we hope to see you again at some of the upcoming events. Thank you, Chris.